So Tom is going to talk about restoration of that in a project called Wetlands Restoration, Ecosystem Services Valuation of a Restored Oyster Reef in San Diego Bay. Tom.
Okay, so today I'd like to highlight the importance and the gap of information regarding wetlands ecosystem services valuation. And I'm going to illustrate this by presenting the results of a work on a restored oyster reef here in San Diego Bay. But first, I'm going to present the global motivation of my work. Then I will introduce my case study. I will describe the methodology and the results from the ecosystem services valuation I conducted. And I'll conclude with some key findings. So, why do we care about wetlands and ecosystem services? Well, Corey gave you a bit of information, but we also care about coastal resilience. Resilience is the capacity to adapt and thrive in changing conditions, as well as recovering from a disrupting event. And here, climate change is threatening shorelines with sea level rise, increased floods, and storm. But new stabilization options are emerging to increase coastal resilience while benefiting local population. Living Shorelines projects are an example of a national answer to protect shorelines while taking part to climate mitigation efforts. They use natural and local elements to protect shorelines, and these elements show adaptive capacities to answer climate change impact like sea level rise. And that is not the case for artificial barriers like a seawall, for example. So not only they protect communities from natural hazards, but they also provide ecosystem services and play a role into a city's economic activities. But we already know that ecosystem restoration are taking part to the climate change mitigation efforts, right? And it's often actually a key argument to develop them. But we don't really know how much they serve that goal. And that's why we need to establish an evidentiary basis to quantify the benefits of wetlands restoration project. This example here illustrates what I just said. So you're seeing a report on 39 native oyster restoration projects on the West Coast. And out of those 39 projects, only 32% included objectives and guidelines for ecosystem services. So for most of these projects, we won't be able to measure how good the ecosystem services are. And if you think of it like a city opening a theater, of course, we know that people go to the theater and it generates revenue, right? But the city will want to know how many people, when do they go, what movies they're going to watch. And it's the same for wetlands restoration. Since investment and resources are allocated to those projects, they need more complete return on investment information. So we identified the need, and now I have to work on an answer. I found a Living Shoreline project here in San Diego, serving as the perfect case study to work on a methodology for ecosystem services valuation. But first, I want to show you why we need wetland restoration in San Diego. So here's a map showing wetlands depletion since 1850. And we can see that more than 70% of San Diego Bay's wetlands have been depleted over the past century. And this aerial view here shows that most of this depletion is due to urban expansion. So wetlands might be the most depleted ecosystem, and we need to fix that. As I mentioned, one Living Shoreline project has recently been launched in San Diego Bay, and will take part to the restoration work. So it is located in the southern part of the bay, in the Chula Vista Wildlife Reserve. And the red dots that you're seeing inside the project area are reef balls. And these elements are going to be disposed on a 10-acre surface area. But the total surface of this reef element is going to be 2.5 acres. And the reef is not fully installed as we speak. So my work is going to be based on the existing literature and similar restoration projects results. And I want to talk a bit more about that project, which is mainly owned by the Port of San Diego. And they have two objectives. First, they want to restore a historically dominant ecosystem here in San Diego. But they also want to develop the natural resources management plan for the bay. And this plan revolves around promoting the ecological values of shorelines while maintaining and protecting those areas. So I used those two objectives to come up with the following research question. What are the economic benefits provided by restoring Olympia oyster here in San Diego Bay? And is this methodology scalable to other coastal wetlands ecosystem? So everything is set now and I can start my work, but first I need to identify ecosystem services. And for oyster reefs, there are plenty because they regulate and benefit their surroundings in many ways. For example, their feeding method improves water quality and influences the chemical parameters locally. But their physical presence also allows for a stable substrate and an additional shelter for biodiversity. And all those actions are really complex and quite interdependent, and they create an almost ever-growing network of ecosystem services. And that would take a longer period of time to be completely assessed. So I focused my work on two ecosystem services. First, the water filtration potential of this oyster reef, because it has multiple benefits. It reduces water pollution, but it also increases the biodiversity activity, and that's of a great economic value. The second ecosystem service I'm going to evaluate is the coastal erosion attenuation by the oyster reef, because that directly affects the value of any infrastructures influenced by this attenuation. So I'm going to walk you through the process of computing the economic value of the reef's water filtration capacity. First, you need to know the amount of water that the reef is going to filtrate, right? So to do that, you need to know the dry wet tissue weight of one oyster, and then you can calculate the filtration rate of one individual. After that, I used the historical distribution of Olympia oyster in the bay to estimate the annual water filtration rate of the fully restored oyster reef. But the thing is that South San Diego Bay is actually larger than what this reef can filtrate in 1 year. So I came up with an average clearance rate, which is the actual amount of water that the reef can filtrate out of an entire body of water. And this rate is dependent on the oyster density and the reef's surface. So if one of those parameters was to increase, the rate would increase as well. So now we know how much water the reef can filtrate, and we need to find what in that water is going to be valuable. And in our case, it's going to be the nitrogen removal capacity of that reef. Nitrogen allows for toxic blooms and low dissolved oxygen, which might be among the most disrupting impacts in coastal ecosystem. And by knowing the nitrogen load to the bay and the reef clearance rate, I'm able to compute the amount of nitrogen that the reef can absorb. And this first information is really important because it identifies the parameters needed to estimate the capacity of an ecosystem to reduce a certain pollution level. So now we want to know the cost of this method. $23 per kilogram is the cost of removing nitrogen by restoring the reef. And you can see it's almost on the same scale as the social cost of nitrogen, which is the cost of having nitrogen in the wild for the society. And I compared those costs to two mechanical methods for nitrogen removal. And you can see that for a similar objective, there is a significant difference because this reef avoid infrastructure and maintenance costs. But I also want to clarify those numbers because there are hypothetical costs, because South San Diego Bay is not yet under a total maximum daily load regulation, which is a restriction in any pollutants load. But it is really important to notify these differences because Rainbow Creek, for example, which is also in San Diego County, is under a need of reducing its nitrogen load by almost 80%. So like in that case, they're gonna need a removal plan and they're gonna need to know on what level they can rely on natural method and at what cost. So for the coastal erosion attenuation of the reef, two infrastructures are concerned and will benefit from the oyster reef existence. And I will focus on a birds observation deck. According to the study report, a 1 to 3% reduction in coastal erosion could be generated by the reef, but I had no information on these infrastructures' cost or value. So I used the cost of replacement of a lifeguard station by making the assumption that a bird observation deck would need similar amount of material. And with that assumption, I was able to obtain a range of cost of replacement by 2030. So the cost expected in 2030 if no measures are implemented. And the coastal erosion attenuation is going to delay the time when these infrastructures needs to be replaced or renovated. So to estimate costs saved by the reef, I compared the present value of cost of replacement in 2030 without erosion attenuation with the present value of cost of replacement by 2030 delayed by the oyster reef. And this method allowed me to estimate the present costs saved by having restored this ecosystem. Now you can see that this number can look small, but they only concern one infrastructure. So they would actually increase if more infrastructure were located in that area. And that might be the case soon because the city of Chula Vista is planning on an urbanization plan just near the reef location. So this will bring more pollutants in that part of the bay, but also more infrastructures. And both could benefit from the reef restoration and development. Now, I want to end this presentation with some key findings to answer my research question. First, two things to remember about the economic benefits of Olympia oyster in San Diego. They save infrastructures and maintenance costs for climate mitigation purpose, and that is an opportunity for many future climate plans. So here I want to highlight again the several orders of magnitude difference between this natural method of pollutants removal versus mechanical methods. And second, I evaluated those benefits, but I also showed that due to the complexity and multiple interactions of ecosystem, I was not able to obtain complete results, right? So the number I computed are actually the lower bound of a complete economic valuation of this reef's ecosystem services. Then I grouped parameters we would need to replicate this methodology in two buckets. First, you have the physical parameters, and here we're talking common measurements that are going to be done in very similar way across a broad range of ecosystems or location. But I want to focus on the importance of ecological assessment and urban planning, and I will describe them right after. But for those parameters, it will be up to local actors to collect this information because they can be geographically super dependent, as it was the case with Chula Vista's urban plan, for example. So specifically, here's a summary of parameters I was able to calculate and that were key to this economic valuation. So for the physical parameters, I won't spend time on it because, as I said, they're well known and they're the groundwork to measure the ecosystem services, and we know how to do that. But an ecological assessment was key to estimate the range of the ecosystem services. So here it's important to do a trade-off analysis, which is a choice of the number of species impacted by the project that we will include in our work. Because that way, you have a clear and transparent view of your results accuracy. For example, in my case, I worked on the pollution aspect of mitigating anthropogenic damage, and I also worked on the physical ecosystem service given by the reef, but they could be more. And the urban planning is not a measure, but it's a key parameter because it's the type and the values of infrastructures that will define the potential saved costs. For example, the Chula Vista urban plan should have integrated the reef because it could have influenced their cost structure. The main takeaway of that work is an opportunity, not a danger or a threat, but really an opportunity to increase the level of information regarding economic benefits of restoration projects. And this will allow local population to benefit from a stronger support in climate mitigation effort. And it's an opportunity because the science is already there, and it's now a question of framework and coordination between different actors to reach a higher level of information. So finally, I really want to thank and say how grateful I am to my committee members. Anna and Erica are in the room today, and they were on site during the whole capstone. They supervise me, with every aspect of my work, from the economic valuation to just getting people's attention or the narrative of that presentation. And Brian works on the East Coast, so he was not able to attend the presentation today, but he's more than 10 years of experience in ecosystem restoration, and he's been working on many native oyster restoration projects. So he was able to guide me through a dense amount of information so I could access every pertinent data I needed. So thanks a lot to them, and thank you for listening. Yeah?
I think you mentioned Olympia oysters.
Yeah.
Aren't the oysters different for the different coastal zones going up to like British Columbia? I mean, I know they've got like Sweck oysters up there, which I've never seen down here.
Well, so they have different kind of oyster, but the only native oyster on the West Coast is the Olympia oyster. And all the other one, for example, a famous one that we have down there in Southern California is the Pacific oyster, which is bigger and has a better commercial value. So it has kind of take over the Olympia oyster in terms of growing industry. But the Olympia oyster is the only native one on the West Coast.
But do the different oysters have different capacities for filtration and so on?
Yeah, because first they have different size, average size, and that's going to impact their filtration rate. So yeah. Actually, the Pacific oyster, for example, would have a higher filtration rate than the Olympia oyster because it's bigger. But the Olympia oyster interacts better with its environment locally.
Thank you.
Hey, Tom, great
Hey,
job.
Rika. Thank you.
So what's one example of a species that might interact with this Olympia oyster reef in terms of habitat provision?
Yeah, that's a good question, and we worked on that a little bit. There is the one fish species, which is a commercial species, the California halibut, which use oyster reef, Olympia oyster reef, as a nursery habitat. So that's one of the additional ecosystem that we could measure and that could provide an economic value because it would increase the California halibut biomass, for example. Yeah. Hi. They come from Japan, I guess, almost sure, but don't quote me on that. Thank you, everyone.